My name is Evelyn Grace Whitmore, and I'm 72 years old. Folks around here in a little Tennessee town know me as that quiet old woman who always brings peach pie to church gatherings, who tends her flowers every morning, and who never misses a Sunday service. They wave at me, smile politely, and think they know my story. But let me tell you, friends, they don't know anything. What they see is just the cover of a book I've kept shut for more than 50 years. Tonight, on this very porch where I've spent half my life, I'm ready to open that book. I want you to walk with me through the chapters I've never dared to read aloud. And maybe, just maybe, together we can lift the weight I've carried in silence all these years. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Are you in a small town like me, where everyone knows each other's business? Or are you in a big city where secrets hide in the crowd? Share it in the comments. I'd love to know where my story is reaching hearts tonight. Now let's go back. Way back. Rural Tennessee, late 1960s. Life was nothing like it is today. A girl's life wasn't her own. First it belonged to her father, then to whatever man he decided should take her hand. I was just 17. Still a child, still clinging to my mama's rag dolls when no one was looking. My days were spent washing clothes under the hot sun and dreaming of something simple, working at the little 5-and-dime store in town, saving for a dress from the Sears catalog. And maybe, if the Lord was kind, marrying the boy I loved. His name was Caleb Turner, a farm boy with soft hands and a smile that made my heart flutter. We'd meet under the old oak tree by the property line, whispering about a future we thought was waiting for us. He talked about buying a patch of land, building us a home. And I believed him because love has a way of making even impossible dreams feel real. But my daddy, Samuel Foster, he was a hard man. The kind life had carved into stone. Our farm was dying, debt was choking us, and pride wouldn't let him bend. That's when a man named Augustus Hartwell started visiting our home. Mr. Hartwell was wealthy, powerful, and at 52 older than my own father. A widower, they said. A man whose first wife had run off, though no one knew the full truth. He had more cattle than I had ever seen in my life, and when he sat at our table, I thought he was there to strike a deal about land. But it wasn't land he was after. His eyes followed me, lingering too long, like I was something to be bought, not someone to be loved. It was Mama who told me the truth. I still remember her trembling hands folding laundry on a heavy August afternoon. Her voice was thin-broken when she said, "Evelyn, honey, your daddy's made arrangements. Mr. Hartwell has asked for your hand, and your daddy's already agreed." I dropped the sheet I was holding. It fell to the dirt floor like my whole world collapsing. "But Mama," I whispered, "what about Caleb? What about what I want?" She couldn't even meet my eyes. "Baby, what we want don't matter when the bills need paying. Your daddy says this is the only way to save us." That night, I ran to the oak tree one last time. Caleb was waiting, his face lighting up the second he saw me. But when I told him the truth, when I said I was promised to another man, that light in his eyes dimmed to nothing but heartbreak. When I told Caleb the truth that my daddy had promised me to Augustus Hartwell, he pulled me into his arms so tight I could barely breathe. I felt his tears mixing with mine under that old oak tree, and the sound of his voice breaking nearly split my heart in two. He swore he'd find a way to stop it. Said he'd beg his boss for an advance scrape together, whatever he could, just to change my father's mind. But we both knew better. In our world, a handshake was as binding as iron chains. Once a man gave his word, it was done. And no amount of begging, pleading, or praying could undo it. I was destined to become Mrs. Augustus Hartwell. The wedding was set for September 15th, just 3 short weeks away. 3 weeks to say goodbye to Caleb, to every dream I'd ever carried in my heart. 3 weeks before I'd be bound to a man whose very presence made my skin crawl. And it was there, staring down at those legal papers spread across our kitchen table, like a death sentence, that I realized something had ended. My childhood, my freedom, my name. I was no longer Evelyn Foster. I was about to be traded like livestock, handed off from one man to another. What I didn't know back then, what I couldn't even imagine, was that my wedding night would not be the end of my suffering, but only the beginning of a story so strange, so terrible, that even now at 72, I sometimes wonder if it was all just a nightmare I never woke from. Friends, let me pause here and ask you, have you ever had a moment where you knew your life was about to change forever, but you were powerless to stop it? If you have, you'll understand the dread that hung over me in those days. The 3 weeks before the wedding dragged by like cold molasses. Every morning, I woke up hoping I dreamed it all. But then Augustus would show up at our door, punctual as a clock, carrying gifts I never wanted, ribbons for my hair, always in colors that didn't suit me. Peppermint candy wrapped in shiny paper, sweet on my tongue, but sour in my stomach. The way he watched me eat it, his pale blue eyes fixed on my lips, made me feel like prey beneath a hunter's shadow. I won't lie to you. Augustus wasn't ugly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver streaking his dark hair. His suits were always pressed sharp. His boots polished, his scent, a strange mix of expensive soap and something sterile like the doctor's office. But what unsettled me most wasn't his looks, it was his voice. He spoke soft, gentle, even as if handling something delicate. But beneath that calm was a claim, a warning. Every time he said my name, Evelyn, darling, it felt like he was tasting it, claiming it as his own. And sometimes, in the middle of conversation, he'd just stop. His face would go blank, like a lamp suddenly snuffed out. His eyes would glaze over, distant, hollow. Then, with a quick shake of his head, he'd come back smiling like nothing had happened. Those moments chilled me more than I can explain. It was like I was catching a glimpse of something I was never meant to see. One afternoon, just a week before the wedding, Augustus asked my father if he could take me for a walk around our land. Of course, Daddy agreed. By then, he'd have agreed if Augustus asked to haul me clear to the moon. We walked in silence, the dry cornstalks crunching beneath our feet, until we reached the fence line, the border where our farm ended and the Murphy farm began. That afternoon, when Augustus stopped walking, he turned to me with those pale, unsettling eyes. Evelyn, he said, softly, softer than I'd ever heard him before. I know this may not be what you would have chosen. For a moment, I was so shocked that I actually lifted my eyes from the ground, something Mama had always told me not to do in front of men. His face looked different, almost vulnerable, as if he wanted to tell me something important but didn't know how. I want you to know he went on raising his hand to touch my cheek with surprising gentleness, that I will take care of you. You'll want for nothing as my wife. You'll have a fine home, pretty dresses, anything your heart desires. But what my heart desired wasn't for sale. My heart wanted Caleb Turner and a life we'd built together with our own hands. Still, I only managed to whisper, "Yes, sir." And that's when Augustus smiled, really smiled. But it wasn't the smile of a kind man. It wasn't joy. It was triumph, like a hunter finally catching the prey he'd been stalking for years. "There's just one thing you must understand," he said, still touching my cheek. His eyes glinted cold in the fading light. "Once you're my wife, you belong to me, not to your parents, not to anyone else. Just me. Do you understand?" I nodded. But inside, my blood turned cold. He hadn't spoken of love. He had spoken of ownership. On the walk back, Augustus seemed lighter, even humming under his breath. But when we passed the Murphy farm, he slowed, turning his head to stare across their fields. His expression shifted into something unreadable, like recognition, like he saw something there that no one else knew. That night I lay in bed, listening to Mama's cough echo through the thin walls. I told myself maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe Augustus would keep his promises. Maybe I could learn to be content with fine clothes and a big house. But deep down in the quiet place where truth whispers, I knew better. There was something hidden in him, something far darker than loneliness or desire. And soon I'd find out just how deep that darkness went, because Augustus Hartwell wasn't marrying me out of love. He was marrying me because of a secret he had carried for 20 years. A secret tied to a debt he believed I could pay. And my wedding night would turn out to be the least of my worries. The night before the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling back to that strange look he gave toward the Murphy farm. Something gnawed at me, sharp and restless, like a splinter under the skin. Around midnight, with Daddy snoring and Mama coughing softly, I slipped from bed and crept to the kitchen window, facing the road. That's when I saw it, a figure stumbling up our dirt path, bathed in silver moonlight. My heart leapt. Even in the shadows, I knew it was Caleb. For a second, hope bloomed wild inside me. Maybe he'd come to stop this wedding. But as he drew closer, my hope crumbled. He was staggering, his shirt dark with blood. I rushed to the door, eased it open in my nightgown, and stepped onto the porch. His eyes met mine, wild, desperate. A cut split his brow, bleeding fresh into his face. "Evelyn." His voice shook. He told me he'd been attacked, 3 men waiting for him on the road home. They'd beaten him, warned him to stay away from me, from my family. And in that moment, I understood something chilling. Augustus Hartwell wasn't just taking me. He was making sure no one stood in his way. But that wasn't the worst of it. Caleb's voice dropped low, trembling as he told me the truth. One of those men had spoken Augustus Hartwell's name, said plain as day that I was already spoken for and Caleb would do well to forget I ever existed. Friends, have you ever felt fear crawl through your veins like ice water? That's what I felt in that moment. Augustus hadn't just won me through a handshake. He had sent men to hurt the boy I loved. This wasn't business. This wasn't debt. This was possession. But Caleb wasn't finished. With blood running down his face and desperation in his eyes, he told me something that nearly made my knees give way. While they were beating him, one of the men let slip the truth about Augustus's first wife, Carmen. She hadn't run off like folks believed. No, she had tried to escape him. And those who helped her paid dearly. The way Caleb's voice cracked, I could feel his terror, not just for himself, but for me. He begged me, then begged me to run away with him that very night. Said we could make it to his cousin's farm in Kentucky before anyone even knew we were gone. For a heartbeat, standing there in the silver wash of moonlight, blood staining the shirt of the boy I loved, I almost said yes. My heart screamed for me to run to take his hand and never look back. But then I thought of Mama, her cough worsening every day. Daddy bent and tired, drowning under debts he couldn't pay. Those bank papers scattered on the kitchen table. If I ran, Augustus would take back his offer. My family would lose everything, maybe even the roof over their heads. And Mama, already so weak, would never survive it. That night, I realized I wasn't just trapped by circumstance. I was trapped by love. My love for my family was chaining me to a man who might be dangerous, who might even be a killer. When Caleb limped away into the darkness, broken and defeated, something inside me went quiet. Not my soul exactly, but my innocence. My belief that goodness would protect me. My faith that love alone could carry me through. It all crumbled that night. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at those debt papers, understanding for the first time that I was no more than a pawn in a game I didn't choose. Augustus hadn't picked me out of affection or even attraction. He'd picked me because he could. Because my father was desperate. Because I came at a price he was willing to pay. And as the first rays of sunlight lit our kitchen, I realized something far more terrifying. If Augustus was willing to have Caleb beaten bloody just for loving me, what would he do to me once I was his wife, alone in his home, far from anyone who could hear me bound to him by law and vow? I suddenly understood that my wedding night wouldn't be about love or tenderness. It would be about ownership. And whatever had happened to Carmen, whatever made her risk everything to escape him, I knew I was staring down the same fate. The wedding was only 8 hours away. I wasn't walking toward a future. I was walking toward destruction. And yet as the sun rose higher, I made myself a promise. A promise I whispered so softly. I don't even know if heaven heard it. I will survive this. Whatever Augustus had planned, whatever shadows he carried from his past, I would live through it. Somehow. Some way. and I would find the light again. But friends, I had no idea how deep the darkness ran. And the greatest shock of my life was waiting for me just beyond those wedding vows. The wedding felt less like a celebration and more like a fever dream. I can still see myself walking down the aisle of that little white church in Buxnaw, wearing Mama's altered wedding dress. Do you ever have those moments, friends, when it feels like you're watching your own life from the outside, like it's happening to someone else? That's exactly how it felt. My body was there, but my spirit was far away, trembling. At the altar, Augustus, now renamed Victor Hartwell, stood tall in his black suit. When I finally reached him, he took my hand, and in his pale blue eyes, I saw not tenderness, but satisfaction. Pastor William spoke of love devotion and honoring your husband. But tell me, dear listeners, do vows still carry meaning when love isn't present? Because in that moment, the only face in my mind was Caleb's, his bruised cheek, his bloodied shirt. When it was my turn to speak, my voice was so faint that people in the back pews leaned forward just to catch my words. Victor's response, however, rang out with the certainty of a conqueror. He wasn't saying vows, he was declaring victory. At the reception, I sat stiffly at the head table, staring at a slice of wedding cake that tasted like sawdust in my mouth. Victor's hand never left my knee, his fingers pressing down through the fabric of my dress, a constant reminder that I now belonged to him. Whenever a guest came by to congratulate us, his grip would tighten, and I had to fight every urge inside me not to flinch. When it was finally time to leave, Victor escorted me into his black Cadillac. To anyone watching, he seemed gentle, but I could feel the tension in his grip, the quiet, barely contained excitement that twisted my stomach. Have you ever been so afraid of silence that even the sound of humming unsettles you? He hummed that same little tune as we drove, and I stared out at the Tennessee countryside, wondering if this was the last time I would ever feel free. Victor's farmhouse loomed large on its lonely hill, a 2-story structure, white paint peeling its shutters worn. But it didn't look like a home. It looked like a prison. The windows watched us like hollow eyes. The air inside carried that same strange medicinal scent I'd noticed on him before, mixed with something musty, something old. He guided me through the house, his hand pressed firmly at the small of my back. The parlor, the dining room, the kitchen. He presented each room like he was a proud host, but I felt more like a guest who would never be allowed to leave. Finally, he led me upstairs, to our bedroom. The room was suffocating, heavy curtains blocking the light, a massive 4-poster bed dominating the space. When the door closed behind us, the click of the latch echoed in my chest like the closing of a coffin lid. Victor turned toward me, and in that moment, everything about him shifted. The careful politeness he had worn like a mask in front of my family was gone. What replaced it was raw, hungry, dangerous. He told me to sit on the bed. My hands shook as I obeyed, fingers clenched in my lap to hide the trembling. Behind me, I heard the rustle of clothes being removed. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might crack my ribs. When I finally saw him. I gasped. Not just from shock, but from terror. He was built in a way that didn't seem human, and the satisfaction on his face as he watched my fear, it was worse than anything I had imagined. Step by step, he moved toward me. Slow, deliberate. Like a predator who knew there was nowhere for his prey to run. And I understood with a clarity that chilled me to the bone that everything I had feared about this night was about to come true. What happened next lasted minutes, but to me, it felt like hours. Hours in which every part of me that was once innocent, once hopeful, was shattered. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, sharp and tearing and overwhelming. I bit down on my lip so hard I drew blood trying not to cry out, but some sounds escaped anyway. Whimpers and gasps that seemed to encourage him rather than generate any sympathy. Jonathan seemed to take a particular pleasure in my distress, whispering things in my ear that made me feel sick and ashamed. He told me this was what I was made for, that I belonged to him, and that I'd better get used to it, because this was going to be my life now. When it was finally over, I lay there feeling like something inside me had been broken beyond repair. Jonathan rolled away from me and was asleep within minutes, snoring softly like what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. I stayed awake all night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how I was going to survive this. Every part of my body hurt. But the worst pain was in my heart, the realization that this was just the beginning. Night after night, with a man who saw me as nothing more than property to be used however he pleased. But as the first grey light of dawn crept through those heavy curtains, I made myself a promise. I was going to find a way to endure this, to survive whatever Jonathan Hale planned to do to me. I wasn't going to let him break me completely, no matter how much he tried. What I didn't know was that the worst was yet to come, and that by the end of the week, I'd discover something about my new husband that would make everything I'd already experienced seem like a gentle introduction to true horror. The first week of marriage taught me things about fear I never knew existed. Jonathan had a routine, and I learned quickly that disrupting it in any way brought consequences I wasn't prepared for. He'd wake before dawn, dress in silence, and expect his breakfast on the table by the time he came downstairs. Coffee black as night eggs over easy bacon, crisp, but not burned. If anything was even slightly off, his mood would darken like storm clouds rolling in. But it wasn't just his perfectionist demands that wore me down. It was the way he'd watch me constantly, like he was studying me for something. He'd sit in his chair after dinner, newspaper in his hands, but his eyes followed my every movement as I cleaned the kitchen. Sometimes I'd catch him staring with a strange, almost confused expression, like he was seeing someone else entirely. The house itself felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite name. Too quiet during the day when Jonathan was out checking his cattle, but it was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you weren't alone. Like something was listening from the corners. The medicine smell was strongest in our bedroom, but I found traces of it throughout the house, in closets behind doors, lingering where it shouldn't be. It was Miss Ruth, the colored woman, who came twice a week to help with the heavy cleaning, who first made me understand that I wasn't losing my mind. Ruth had been working for Jonathan for nearly 15 years, since before his first wife, Lydia, had left. And she knew things about this house that nobody else did. Ruth was a small, weary woman with graying hair, always pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She moved through the house like someone who'd learned to be invisible, speaking only when spoken to. But I could feel her watching me, with a mixture of pity and something else. Recognition, maybe. It was during my second week in that house that Ruth finally broke her silence. Jonathan had gone to town for supplies, and I was in the kitchen trying to scrub a stain out of one of his shirts. When Ruth appeared beside me with a cup of coffee I hadn't asked for, she set it down on the counter and stood there for a moment, like she was making up her mind about something important. Then she looked directly at me for the first time since I'd arrived, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She told me that Lydia used to get those same bruises I was trying to hide with long sleeves and high necklines. She said Lydia had been young too, when she married Jonathan, maybe 19 or 20, and that, in the beginning, she tried to make the best of things, just like I was doing. But then Ruth said something that made my blood freeze in my veins. She told me that Lydia hadn't been Jonathan's only wife. There had been another one years before, a girl named Eleanor, who lasted less than a year before she disappeared one winter night. Folks assumed she'd run off too, but Betty had her suspicions. The way her hands trembled when she told me this, I knew she was risking everything just by speaking. She explained that Edward had a way of getting attached to young wives. But that attachment wasn't love. It was possession, pure and simple. And when that possession was threatened, or when the wives tried to assert any independence, things turned dangerous fast. Betty warned me never to mention my family or my old life, because Edward despised being reminded that his wives had once existed before him. She told me Carmen had made that mistake, talking about her sister in Memphis, who kept writing letters, and that was when things had really started going downhill. But the most chilling thing Betty shared was about the basement. She said Edward kept it locked at all times, and sometimes at night she could hear sounds coming from down there. Not animal sounds, but something else, something that made her skin crawl. She'd asked him once years ago, and his fury had been so violent that she never brought it up again. As Betty gathered her supplies to leave that day, she pressed something into my hand, a small brass key, warm from her palm. She whispered that it was a spare key to the back door, and that if I ever needed to leave quickly, I'd find it hidden under the loose board on the back porch steps, the third one from the top. After she left, I sat in that cavernous kitchen, staring at the key, trying to process what she told me. If there had been other wives who hadn't just run away, but vanished, then I wasn't merely dealing with a cruel, abusive husband. I was living inside something far darker. That night, Edward returned from town in high spirits, whistling the same off-key tune, and brought me a bag of peppermint sticks from the general store. But instead of feeling gratitude for the gesture, I found myself scrutinizing his face, searching for the shadows Betty had warned me about. It was after dinner, while he read his paper, that I noticed something I had overlooked before. A ring of keys hung from his belt, and one of them was different. Older, ornate. A key that looked like it belonged to something important. When I asked about it, my voice careful light. His body went rigid. He told me it was the key to his office in the barn, where he kept important papers, and that I was never to go near that place. The way he said it wasn't a request, nor even a command. It was a threat delivered in that soft, deliberate tone. I feared more than shouting, but I'd seen something flicker in his eyes when I asked about it. Fear. And I knew then that whatever he was hiding in that barn wasn't paperwork. It was something he would kill to protect. Something tied to the stories Betty had whispered about the other wives. That night, lying awake beside Edward's steady breathing, I understood the truth. I wasn't just trapped in a bad marriage. I was ensnared in something far worse. If I wanted to survive long enough to see my family again, I'd have to outthink him, outlast him, discover his secrets before they consumed me. The question was, could I do it in time, or was I destined to vanish into the Tennessee hills, another young wife erased, leaving behind nothing but rumors and silence? 3 weeks into my marriage, I received something that upended everything I thought I knew about Edward and his past. It came in the form of a letter. A Tuesday morning, while Edward was out mending fences in the far pasture, the mailman, Mr. Henderson, handed it to me with a curious look. The envelope bore careful handwriting, and when I opened it, my hands shook so violently I nearly dropped it. It was from Carmen Edwards' first wife, the one everyone believed had run away years ago. But she wasn't writing from some distant city where she'd built a new life. She was writing from Mercy General Hospital in Nashville. And the words on that page, they didn't just surprise me. They shattered the ground I thought I was standing on. Carmen explained that she hadn't run away like folks in town always whispered. She'd been trapped in the mental ward at Mercy General for 12 long years. And who put her there? Augustus. Or as you know him in our story now, Jonathan Hartwell. He hadn't sent her away because she'd lost her mind. No. She'd simply tried to leave him. And when he caught her with her suitcase packed, he called on one of his doctor friends. Back then, a husband's word carried more weight than a woman's whole life. With a few signatures, Carmen was declared insane and locked away indefinitely. My friends watching this, can you imagine? Just take a moment. What if back in those days, someone could erase you from the world with nothing but a lie? Tell me in the comments, do you think you would have been strong enough to fight back, or would fear have kept you silent? But it was the warning Carmen wrote that turned my blood to ice. She said Jonathan had a sickness, a pattern. He didn't love his wives, he collected them. And when they tried to be independent, when they dared to remember the lives they'd had before him, that's when things turned dangerous. Carmen confessed she had tried to keep writing letters to her family. That was the beginning of her downfall. Jonathan started whispering about her being touched in the head, planting seeds until the world believed it. But the part that nearly made me drop the letter was this. Carmen said Jonathan had shown her photographs, not of her, of Sarah the wife before her. Photographs that proved Sarah hadn't run away. He kept them in a tin box hidden somewhere in the house. Carmen begged me to be careful, to never let Jonathan know I had received her letter. She warned me that he would likely try the same thing with me. It only takes a few doctor visits, a few whispers about erratic behavior, she wrote, and you'll vanish behind the walls of Mercy General too. And once you're there, you might as well be dead. I burned that letter in the stove. Watch the flames curl around the paper until there was nothing left but ash. But her words, they stayed with me, echoed in every corner of my mind. Every time Jonathan looked at me with those cold eyes, every time he tilted his head and said something about my strange moods, I wondered, was he already laying the foundation to have me committed? The following Saturday gave me the answer I wasn't ready for. Jonathan was in town for his monthly cattle buyers meeting, which always took most of the day. I was cleaning our bedroom when I noticed one floorboard near the window gave a hollow sound when I stepped on it. My heart pounded. Could it be? I pried it up, and there in the dark space beneath was a tin box, small like something that might once have held cigars. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. Inside were photographs, just like Carmen said. But they weren't only of Sarah. There were pictures of me, dozens of them, long before our wedding, hanging laundry at my parents' house, walking to church, sitting under the oak tree where I used to meet Caleb. Jonathan had been watching me, studying me, like I was prey, and then buried deeper in the stack came the photographs that made my breath stop. Sarah, the wife before Carmen, her blonde hair loose, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't posing. She was bound to a chair in what looked horrifyingly like the basement. Some photos showed her half undressed crying. Others showed her barely moving at all. And the last made me drop the box and crawl backward across the floor. Sarah lay still on a wooden table, her skin waxy, lifeless. Mixed in with the photographs were yellowed newspaper clippings. Missing women. Not just wives, farm girls, young women from nearby towns. Some gone 20 years. Each article had notes scribbled in Jonathan's handwriting. His observations, and at the very bottom, a journal. His journal. 15 years' worth of entries. Cold, careful handwriting. Each page describing his wives, their attempts at freedom, and his methods for correcting them. Friends, if you're watching this right now, what would you have done? If you'd found that box, would you have run or tried to outsmart a man like Jonathan? Tell me below. I really want to hear how you would have survived. Because as for me, I realized then that I wasn't in a marriage. I was in a prison, a deadly one. The most recent entries in that journal were about me. He wasn't just writing about my habits, he was rating me. Rating my compliance level as if I were part of some twisted experiment. One entry dated just 3 days before our wedding made my blood turn to ice. Victor, that's what I'll call him, had written out his entire plan. How he would slowly cut me off from my family. How he would keep me under his control until I no longer had anyone to turn to. And once I'd served my purpose, he intended to have me committed, just like he had done with Isabella before me. Friends, can you imagine reading something like that? Tell me, if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you run that very night, or would you stay silent, pretending nothing was wrong, just to survive? Victor's writing didn't stop there. He'd written about Isabella, how successful it had been to have her declared insane and locked away. How convenient it was that no one believed her side of the story. But the most chilling part was his last entry. It was written just 2 days after our wedding night. He complained that I wasn't responding to his methods the way he wanted. He wrote that he might have to accelerate his timeline. And worse, he mentioned the basement, how it had been useful for training Eleanor, the wife before Isabella. And now he was considering whether he'd need to use it for me. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I put everything back in the tin box, replaced the floorboard, and tried to make the room look untouched. But deep inside, I knew one thing: I was running out of time. Victor wasn't just an abusive husband. He was something much darker, a predator who had been refining his cruelty for years. And now, I was simply the next victim in his carefully written script. That night, as he sat in the parlor, reading his newspaper, I forced myself to act normal. But every glance he cast in my direction, every casual comment about my behavior, all I could hear were the words from that journal. He was studying me, testing me, writing notes in his head for the next entry. And the cruelest part of all, I had to play along. I had to smile, cook his meals, and sleep beside him, knowing full well the monster he really was. I lay awake in bed, listening to his steady breathing, his arm heavy across my body like a shackle. And I knew my time was running out. If I didn't escape soon, I would end up just like Eleanor. Another frightened face, trapped forever in a photograph, buried in that tin box beneath the floorboards. When October came early that year, the cold wrapped around that house like a coffin. And Victor's eyes, they grew sharper, watching me more closely, asking strange questions about my family. Do you miss them? Do you ever think about visiting? Each question felt like a snare. And I knew exactly what he was doing, building the case. Just like Isabella had warned, it was a Thursday evening 6 weeks after our wedding when it finally happened. Dinner had been quiet. Too quiet. He barely touched his food, but I could feel his gaze on me the entire time. After I cleaned the dishes, he called me into the parlor. His voice calm, measured like a doctor about to deliver bad news. 2 chairs had been placed in front of the fireplace facing each other. When I sat down, he leaned so close, our knees almost touched. His pale eyes burned into mine, unblinking, unshaken. His words came soft and rehearsed, like he'd spoken them to every woman before me. He talked about how much our marriage meant to him, how lucky he was to have found someone so young, so pure. But it didn't sound like love. It sounded like a performance. And every movement of his hand, adjusting his cuffs, smoothing his hair, fingering the brass key at his belt, felt like part of a ritual he had done many, many times. Then came the questions. Are you sleeping well? Have you noticed changes in your mood? Any feelings you can't explain. They sounded innocent. But you and I both know what they were traps. each answer another piece of evidence he could twist into madness. I forced a smile. Told him I was fine, perfectly fine. But I saw it in his face. He didn't believe me. Or maybe he didn't need to, because then Victor brought out the photographs. They weren't the same photographs I had found in the tin box. No, these were different. Older. More deliberate. Augustus spread them out on the small table between us, as if he were dealing a game of cards. Each movement was slow, practiced, almost ritualistic. The firelight flickered against the glossy paper, revealing faces of women I had never seen before. Each one had the same expression, that hollow, haunted look in their eyes. The same look I had begun to see in the mirror lately. He told me so casually that these were women he had helped over the years. Women who had suffered from what he called nervous conditions. He described their symptoms like he was reading from a textbook, and then almost proudly listed the treatments he had used. But the way his fingers lingered on those photographs, the quiet satisfaction in his voice, told me the truth. He wasn't talking about healing. He was talking about ownership, about control. One picture in particular stopped me cold. A young woman with dark hair, her eyes wide, terrified. There was something in her face, something familiar. Who is she? I asked. For the first time, his composure slipped. His lips twitched, and I saw it, that raw hunger in his eyes. Rebecca, he said softly. She was a special case. The way he said special made my skin crawl. He went on to explain that Rebecca had been resistant to conventional treatment, that she had required something more immersive, something he called environmental therapy. My stomach turned. I already knew what that meant before he even moved. Augustus stood, walked to the window, and looked out toward the barn. The night was heavy and dark, but there, it was a faint light glowing from an upstairs window I had never noticed before. He nodded slowly, like a teacher pleased that his student had finally caught up. Yes, he murmured. I still maintain the facility. One must always be prepared for special cases. And the way his eyes cut back to me told me everything I needed to know. The facility wasn't for some hypothetical patient. It was for me. Friends, if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you run? Would you stay quiet and pretend? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you would choose, sitting in that chair with the firelight flickering and a monster smiling across from you. But it didn't end there. No. Augustus leaned back, smoothed his cuffs, and then said something that made every drop of blood in my body turn cold. He said he'd received word that day about Caleb Winchester. My Caleb, my oldest friend. There had been an accident, Augustus explained. Caleb had been found unconscious at the Murphy farm, badly injured. In the hospital now, doctors unsure if he would even wake. And then Augustus added in that same calm, deliberate voice, "It's such a shame about young men who don't know how to mind their own business." He didn't need to say anything else. I knew. Caleb's accident wasn't an accident. Augustus had decided that if he couldn't isolate me by patience, he would do it by force, by tearing away every last connection to the world I once had. The light in the barn window pulsed faintly in the distance like a heartbeat, like a warning. That night, lying stiff as a corpse beside Augustus, feeling his contentment radiate like heat, I understood something with terrifying clarity. He wasn't going to wait. He was ready. And the treatment facility was waiting for me. The careful game we'd been playing was drawing to an end, and I knew soon I would uncover the truth about Rebecca, about Sarah, and about all the other women in those photographs. The only question that haunted me was this: would I live long enough to tell anyone? Or would I simply become another picture in Victor Hartwell's collection? Another silent story in his twisted archive of women who had endured his so-called special treatments. Friends, let me pause here. If you were in my place, standing on the edge of this dark discovery, would you risk escape? Or would you keep quiet, hoping to survive one more day? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know how you would handle it. That Friday morning, I awoke to find Victor, already dressed, standing at the foot of the bed. He was holding a cup of coffee, watching me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't his usual cold detachment, nor even anger. No, what I saw in his eyes was anticipation. The kind of eager, burning excitement a child might have on Christmas morning, knowing exactly what present was waiting. He told me he had special plans for the day. We were going to take a tour of his property so I could finally understand the full scope of what he had built. And when he said the full scope, I knew he wasn't talking about crops or cattle. He was talking about the barn, the one with the glowing window in the night. Breakfast that morning was different. Victor had cooked it himself, something he had never done before. He sat across from me, watching me eat each bite with unnerving intensity. The eggs tasted like sawdust, the coffee like ash. But I forced myself to swallow. A quiet voice inside whispered that this might be my last proper meal for a very long time. After breakfast, the air outside was sharp and cold, October mist curling up from the fields. Victor gripped my elbow firmly like a guard escorting a prisoner as he led me toward the barn. Every step made my chest feel tighter, my heart pounding like a caged bird, desperate to break free. He spoke as though he were giving a tour of something he was proud of. He explained how he had designed the barn himself. Extra thick walls for soundproofing, custom ventilation to control the air, even modifications to ensure complete isolation. Each detail he described felt less like farming and more like imprisonment. At the heavy wooden doors, Victor produced an ornate key I had noticed before. He unlocked the barn with ceremonial precision, as though opening a sacred temple. The hinges groaned as the doors swung wide, revealing not the hay-filled interior one might expect, but something entirely different, something darker. The ground floor had been divided into rooms, each with solid doors and wiring running across the ceiling. And then my eyes found the staircase. Strong wooden steps leading up to a second level. My legs weakened as Victor placed his hand on my back and guided me upward. What waited for me above was a place that stole the breath from my lungs. The upper level was no barn. It was a prison disguised as a medical facility. Rows of small fortified rooms, each with tiny windows and ventilation grates. The air smelled sterile, unnatural. Victor showed me the first room, proudly explaining how it had been designed to ensure security while maintaining humane conditions. But when we reached the largest room at the end of the hall, I understood the full weight of his madness. It was a laboratory, a twisted hospital, a metal table with restraints bolted down, cabinets filled with medical tools and bottles, charts pinned to the walls, photographs documenting women who had once been healthy but were now nothing but hollow shells of themselves. He called it research. I called it what it was, a trophy room for a predator. And then, as if he hadn't destroyed enough of my hope, Victor told me the most horrifying truth of all. His first wife, Anna, the woman everyone believed had disappeared nearly 2 decades ago, was still alive. She was here, in this barn. He led me to a small door at the far end of the hall. His key clicked in the lock, and when the door creaked open, the sight inside burned itself into my memory forever. Sarah sat huddled on a narrow bed, her eyes lifeless, so empty that they no longer responded to our presence. The once youthful woman in the wedding photo had now aged decades. Her once golden hair was now white, her body so thin and frail that she was only a shadow of herself. She was still alive, but everything that had once made Sarah human had been peeled away, crushed bit by bit. And then Augustus told me that this was his greatest achievement. Sarah, who had been his wife, had been transformed completely from a proud, vibrant young woman to a docile specimen, with no memories, no dreams, no personality, other than the instinct to survive. 3 years, he said it had taken 3 years to break her soul, and he considered that a victory. Dear friends, try to put yourself in my shoes at that moment. If you were you standing in front of someone who used to be his wife, used to be his lover now, reduced to a living corpse, how would you feel? Let me know in the comments, because I believe many of you watching from different parts of the world will have different reactions. When I looked at Sarah, I suddenly understood a terrible truth. Her fate was the same as the future Augustus had planned for me. Not death, but a slow destruction, bit by bit, until there was nothing left but an empty body. He wanted to make me the next success in his sick collection. But at that moment when I looked at Sarah, something inside me ignited. Maybe it was the anger that had been pent up for so long, or maybe it was because I realized that death would be much easier than being kept in that living hell. And I promised myself I would not become another Sarah. I would rather die like Clementine Foster than live like a puppet in the hands of Augustus Hartwell. But what to do? A man who had prepared for 20 years, had the law to protect him, had an environment that he controlled every corner. How could I resist? However, on the way back home, while Augustus was still talking passionately about his research and rehabilitation plan for me, I began to think of a bold plan. Dangerous, crazy, maybe suicide. But it was the only option. That night, when he fell asleep breathing steadily, I decided to act. My heart was pounding violently, as if just one beat would be enough to wake him up. I moved slowly, inch by inch, so as not to make the bed creak. The wooden floorboards were my worst enemy, but weeks of careful observation had taught me where to avoid them. I had hidden the spare key Betty had given me in my shoe during the day. My hand shook as I took it out, nearly dropping it twice. My plan was simple, but also daring. I had to get to the warehouse, find evidence of what he had done, and somehow get it to town before he found out. Only with evidence would the police listen. Outside, the October night was cold. I didn't dare wear a coat for fear of waking him. Barefoot in a thin nightgown, I crept across the frost-covered lawn. Every step was a cold knife cutting into the soles of my feet, but I didn't stop. Ahead, the huge warehouse loomed like a monument to evil. I trembled, but I kept moving. Using the key I had taken from his belt, I opened the heavy wooden door. It was pitch black inside. I took out a few matches from the kitchen and lit them with trembling hands. The small light flickered, casting shadows on the thick walls, and the first feeling I had was that I had just opened the gates of hell. The tiny flame trembled in my hand, painting the walls with shadows that twisted and stretched like monsters. Each flicker looked like him, like Edward, ready to drag me back into his nightmare. I climbed the narrow staircase step by step as though walking toward my own execution. Every creak beneath my feet echoed like a warning, each sound pulling me deeper into the abyss of Edward's madness. And then everything changed. At the top, I reached a familiar room, the one Edward had shown me before. The room where Emma, his so-called success story, sat motionless like a broken doll. But tonight, the door wasn't closed. It was wide open. And Emma wasn't sitting there anymore. She was standing. When the flame brushed her face, I froze. Her eyes, they weren't empty. Not anymore. For the first time, I saw awareness, recognition, and buried deep inside something else, something I never thought I'd see again. Hope. Her voice was a whisper, softer than the rustle of dry leaves. I've been waiting for you. I leaned closer, straining to hear. She told me she had been pretending all these years. Pretending to be broken, compliant, defeated. Waiting for the right person to come along. Someone strong enough, desperate enough to help her end Edward's reign of terror. Friends, let me pause for a second here. If you were watching this unfold, if you were standing in that dark barn staring into Emma's eyes, would you trust her? Would you believe that spark of hope? Or would you think it was another trick Edward planted? Tell me in the comments. I want to know what you would do in my place, Emma went on. She revealed something even more horrifying than I imagined. Edward wasn't just experimenting on women. He was selling them. There was an entire network of men like him. Men with money power and connections. They called them special subjects. To them, these women weren't victims. They were merchandise. Emma led me to a hidden compartment in her room. She had been digging it for years, using nothing more than a stolen spoon. Inside, she'd hidden the truth letters, receipts, photographs. Proof of Edward's twisted business. The worst part, a ledger. A black book that listed every woman who had ever passed through his barn. Some were retained, others were transferred. A few were marked simply disposed. And there, at the bottom of the last page, was my name. Beside it, Edward had written my estimated breaking time and my potential resale value. My blood turned to ice. Emma squeezed my hand. Her voice no longer trembled. We can end this. Tonight. But before I could answer, we heard it. The barn doors creaked open below. Edward was awake, and he wasn't alone. Multiple voices echoed up the stairwell. Male voices, cold, familiar. Emma's grip on my arm tightened. "It's them," she whispered. "The buyers. We weren't just trapped in Edward's nightmare. We were surrounded by the very men who had fueled it for years." Emma's eyes, once dead and hollow, burned with sudden fire. She pulled me back into her room and lifted a small wooden box from under her cot. Inside was a can of kerosene and a box of matches. Her plan was clear. If we couldn't escape with the evidence, we would destroy everything. Better ashes than chains, better flames than silence. As the footsteps grew louder, Edward's voice rose above them all. Calm, certain, calling my name. And in that moment I realized our choice was no longer about survival. It was about defiance, about how we wanted this story to end with false sweetness. Eleanor and I made our choice. If we couldn't live as free women, then at least we could die, ensuring no one else would endure the same torment in this cursed place. But just as Eleanor struck the first match, something happened that neither of us had imagined, something that would forever change everything. Something that gave us back the hope we thought was lost. The sharp wail of sirens cut through the night air, growing louder with every heartbeat. And for the first time, Victor's confident, cruel voice cracked into pure panic as he realized his carefully built empire was collapsing around him. But it wasn't the sirens that saved us that night. No. It was something far more miraculous, something I never could have believed if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Elena's hand trembled as she held that lit match, ready to burn away 20 years of secrets along with ourselves, when Victor appeared at the top of the stairs. But he wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits stood beside him, and in that moment, I didn't see the cold, calculating monster I had come to fear. I saw something else entirely. Terror. Relief. And then, to my utter shock, tears. Those men weren't his allies. They were federal agents who had been tracking the trafficking network for over 3 years. And Victor, yes, Victor, the man I thought had destroyed my life, had been secretly working as their informant for the last 6 months. Every discovery I had made, every piece of evidence Eleanor had risked her sanity to collect, Victor had been passing it to the authorities. It turned out Victor Moreau wasn't the mastermind. He had once been the most tormented victim of all. 23 years earlier, the very same men had kidnapped his younger brother Matteo and forced Victor to watch as they tortured and killed him. They threatened his parents' lives unless he turned his farm into a front for their crimes. For over 2 decades, he had been their prisoner too, forced into acts that shattered his soul. Piece by piece, the hospital beds, the cruel rooms, even the twisted treatment of Eleanor, it had all been theater convincing the real monsters that he was one of them. Well, in truth, he was quietly gathering evidence to one day bring them down. Eleanor had known the truth for years. She'd played the part of the broken woman to protect the ruse while documenting everything in secret. When Victor finally looked me in the eyes, his whole facade collapsed. He broke down sobbing from somewhere so deep, it chilled me. Through tears, he confessed he had tried to protect me the only way he could by marrying me, before the network could take me by force. His proposal to my father hadn't been arrogance. It had been desperation. He'd learned they were planning to take me regardless, and the strangest, most heartbreaking truth of all. Victor had been poisoning himself with laudanum for years, numbing his mind just enough to survive the horrors he was forced to commit. But since our wedding, he'd been fighting to cut the dose, trying to stay clear-headed enough to keep me safe. That's when Elena's voice, steady for the first time in years, cut through the silence. She told me that every moment of cruelty I endured in that house had been as agonizing for Victor as it was for me. She had seen him collapse after the wedding night, vomiting, weeping, begging God for forgiveness for what he'd been forced to do in the shadows. The federal agents explained that my escape attempt had actually triggered the final raid. When Victor realized I was gone, he sent the signal. And that night, as dawn broke over the Tennessee hills, dozens of officers swarmed the property. Piece by piece, they tore down the empire that had haunted us for decades, and Victor finally was free. The man who once terrified me became someone unrecognizable. Gentle, shattered, but desperate to atone. He begged for divorce immediately, insisting that what had been done to me in his name was unforgivable, even if it had been forced upon him. He bought me a small house in town, gave me money to start fresh. And when Daniel Whitmore, the man I truly loved, recovered from his injuries, Victor personally apologized and blessed our union. The trials lasted 3 long years, years in which Victor rebuilt his soul with the help of Pastor Williams and a community slowly learning the truth that he had been a victim all along. And during that time, a miracle happened. Carmen returned. She hadn't been in an asylum, but in hiding, working all along with the same federal agents. She and Victor healed together, carrying scars, but finally free to love. At 25, I married Daniel in the little white church where I once thought my life was ending. Instead, it became the place where mine truly began. Under the oak tree, we built the family we had once only dreamed about. Victor and Carmen spent 20 years together, finally tasting peace. And when Victor passed away at 72, he left this world knowing he had saved countless lives, his testimony convicting monsters who once seemed untouchable. And now here I am, 70 years old, surrounded by 9 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren who fill my Sundays with laughter. When I look back at those terrible days, I see God's hand guiding every moment, even in the valley of shadows. If you're watching this right now, are facing something that feels impossible, something that seems ready to break you, please remember my story. Appearances deceive. Sometimes the very thing that looks like your destruction can become your salvation. And I'd love to know, where are you watching this from? Maybe from Tennessee, like me, or from another part of the world. Share it in the comments, because it warms my heart to know how far these words can travel. If this old woman's tale touched your heart, please share it. Let it reach someone who needs hope tonight. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more, because I still have a lifetime of stories of love, pain, and redemption. And remember, if I can survive the darkest night and still find the dawn, then so can you.